Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits, where, as always, you know what we like to do: fling open the doors of a local comic book shop and bring you interviews with your favorite comic book creators of yesterday and today. And today is no different. But before we get to that, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Joe Marcello.
I'm Mike Farah.
And today is just an amazing interview. It's a long time coming, twice. Mike will get into that in further detail, but we're talking to none other than the duo of Walt Simonson and Louise Simonson. Just an absolute honor and a privilege to be talking to the both of them together. We get into their career, how their careers cross paths, as well as obviously Death of Superman and Louise's involvement in that, as well as Walt's involvement in various Thor storylines as well as X-Men. It's a fabulous interview.
Yeah, we're sort of all over the place, kind of looking all the nooks and crannies of their dual careers. Joe mentioned a lot of the projects. X Factor, where it was where they first worked together as writer and artist. We talk a little bit about those X-Men crossovers that Louise debuted with Mutant Massacre. And they talk a little bit about co-writing Havoc Wolverine Meltdown. But Joe referred to when this is a long time coming and twice is that he actually recorded this interview almost about 2 years ago. And through the not the luck of the Irish, but the bad luck of technology, that interview was lost to time, never shall be heard again. But we had the opportunity to talk to Walt and Louise again. We took that opportunity. I think it probably turned out to be a better interview overall. And so we were excited to do it. So without further ado, this is Walter and Louise Simonson.
We have Walt and Louise Simonson. How are you both?
We're just fine. Thank you very much. Well, I speak for me. Weezy should speak for herself.
Good too.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on. I know, Walt, we've spoken previously, and Louise, we were just absolutely just, oh man, I can't begin to tell you how excited we were to have you on and to both of you together. So, dare I say, for comic book fans like us, this is a dream come true. That being said, I'm going to kick it off the way we do with everyone. Is to ask how you first discovered comics. Louise, I will ask you first.
Oh, probably the way every child in America discovers comics is on the comic rack at the local, gee, for me, it was a local drugstore. It's the first time I ever saw a comic book was that way. I wasn't allowed to read a lot of comics. I wasn't encouraged to read comics. I was encouraged to read books, but I did have a subscription to Duck Comics. So Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge and all of that. Back in the olden days when I was reading comics, there weren't any Marvels at all. I mean, didn't even exist yet. So it was mostly Superman and that Superman, I guess Superman and how he was the superhero comic that I was familiar with. And there was Lone Ranger and I don't know, Archie and Veronica and Sugar and Spike and I don't know, Lone Ranger and I don't know, Brothers of the Spear and all of those, a lot of other different kinds of comics other than superhero comics.
Walt, how about yourself?
About the same, and I read a lot of the same comics Weezy did, apparently, although we did not live in the same state. But we are about the same age. I don't remember the first comic I read. My first memory of comics, I have two actually. One, I had two friends my age. This would have been we were 4 or 5. One lived on the next block over from me. One lived up the hill. They had comics. I used to go to their house and we would play, but I'd also read the comics. So I saw stuff like there was a John Carter of Mars, which was my introduction to Edgar Rice Burroughs. It was part of a trilogy of comics. I did not see the others for years, but this was the first one. It was A Princess of Mars. I forgot if that was the name of the comic, literally. Might have been by Jesse Marsh, the guy who drew Tarzan. He drew, of course, this was in the old days. He drew a very different kind of Mars and the outfits that Deja Thoris wore or John Carter compared to what's in the text. But I still thought the comic was fascinating. I must have read it a dozen times, maybe more. And my other friend had a bunch of comics, including one that had several. It was a Western comic. I couldn't find it for many years, and eventually, thanks to Kurt Busiek, I located it. It was oh, good grief, All-Star Western. I think probably All-Star Western 60. I'd have to go back and look now. There was a character named. There were 4 stories in it. Trigger Twins was the lead feature by Carmine Infantino, and there was a story in there called of a character named Don Caballero who fought a bad guy named El Fuego, the Flame. It was kind of a Zorro-like comic. Took place in Alta California. And for some reason, that story absolutely riveted me. I must have gone back to Jay's house and read it a million times. But eventually he was gone. The comics were gone. And it took me years and years and years and years and Kurt to find out what the comic book was. And I finally nailed my own copy. So, and then I read everything, stuff that Wheezy read. Favorites were Little Lulu, the Duck work by Carl Barks, even at a young age. I could tell the good duck artist, as he used to be called. And so I read Uncle Scrooge. I read the Walt Disney comics and stories. I could read anything I get my hands on. My parents encouraged our younger brother. They encouraged us to read because they wanted to instill the habit of reading, and they weren't so concerned about what we were reading. And back then, comics were really for kids. This was the early mid 50s, late 50s. So I read Turok: Son of Stone a little bit later. Lone Ranger comics, Gene Autry. There was a comic dedicated to Silver, the Lone Ranger's horse. And I think there was a comic for Champion, Gene Autry's horse, for a few issues. I read a lot of Classics Illustrated. I found Frankenstein. I forgot the name of the artist now. I can look it up. It's a guy who penciled it. He did some other work in comics, and a woman who inked it. And honestly, I found that comic so disturbing that I burned it in our fireplace. I got out the poker and I put my comic in the fireplace and I burned it and opened up each page very carefully so it would all burn. Eventually, of course, when I got older, I went back and bought the comic again because I have to buy this. I have to have this comic book. So, I read the history of the FBI, Taras Bulba, A Tale of Two Cities, all that stuff, whatever I could find. The Three Musketeers is maybe my favorite. Beautiful artwork it turns out by George Evans, all brush artwork. It's just lovely. I think it's one of the best jobs George ever did. And, Sea Hunt, Tarzan, Brothers of the Spear, the backup feature Weezy mentioned, and whatever else I could get my hands on. So I was a big John Stanley fan, the guy that wrote and drew Little Lulu without knowing his name for many years. But I just read everything. The funny comics, dramatic comics, TV adaptations, movie adaptations. One of my favorites was Helen of Troy, done about 1955 or 56. There was a movie out by Robert Wise of Helen of Troy. Rosanna Podesta was the lead. Jack Cernas, I think, played Paris. It was a mixture of Italian and English actors. And the comic is just beautiful. You can find a copy. It's worth a look. It's gorgeously drawn. It turns out it was drawn by John Buscema. I don't think he inked it. He thought maybe he had, but I've seen other movie comics from him at the same time, Ulysses, I think, and some other stuff. And that's clearly brush inking. It's clearly John. This is very fine-grained inking, much more delicate than John's stuff was back at the time, I think. And so I'm guessing, the guess was that Sal may have inked it, although it's not clear. But again, just read everything and loved it all.
We're going to bounce around a little bit here, but this is in themes of firsts. And I wanted to know about the first time you both worked together as writer and artist. Was that X Factor or was it something before that?
She is writer and artist. It might have been X Factor
Probably X Factor.
because we did work where Weezy was the editor and I drew it for Warren magazines, and there was work that I inked for Wheezy when she was at Warren still. I inked Carmen Infantino. I inked 3 of his jobs. She was my editor. Actually, I began writing at the end of the 70s or very early 80s on Battlestar Galactica. She was the editor on there. The Value of Nepotism. She got me when my writer quit, left the book. She asked me if I wanted to take it over, like the last few issues. So my first writing was done for her, but I was also doing layouts for Klaus Janson Inc. But I think probably there's nothing for Warren, I don't think that you wrote that I did. Yeah, I'm guessing probably X Factor was the first time that we worked together where she wrote it and I drew it. That's probably right.
Do you remember from that time, having both had collaborations up until that point, this particular collaboration being any different, easier, more difficult than what you had done when you had not obviously worked together in other projects?
Well, it's easier in a way because Walter was in the same house I was, so that he could. I mean, we worked maybe differently than I had worked with other people because I would do a plot and then you would do thumbnails is the way it worked, right, Walter? If I'm
Yeah,
remembering
that's right.
a long time, but you would do kind of rough thumbnails. And then I would script from the thumbnails.
That's right.
And then you would do pencils after that. So you more or less had the script in front of you when you did the pencils, which is not the way you usually work, but which I mean, you controlled the flow of the story because you did the thumbnails.
But it worked fine. I mean, I blew the
Yeah.
thumbnails up in a Xerox machine and then traced them off on the artboard. And the script was written by that time, so I could really make sure that if I had a thumbnail that didn't quite fit the script, I could change the drawing easily. We had a very easy time working together. It was not really, we always did. We did some work where we wrote together on a book called Meltdown in the late 70s, was that, or late 80s? Late 80s, I
Late
think.
80s.
And that was Havoc and Wolverine. We wrote it. John J. Muth and Kent Williams painted it. And when we wrote it, it was a simple. I mean, we plotted it out, and then one of us would be scripting. It was done Marvel style, so we had the artwork. We had Xerox of the artwork in front of us to write from, and one of us would write and write and write and write, and finally you'd be exhausted, and you'd get up, and the other person would sit right down and just start writing and writing and writing and writing. And so we just took turns back and forth. At this point, I could not tell you. I have no idea who wrote what each of us wrote. Generally, Wheezy was better at character stuff. I was better at snappy patter. So we kind of did that in the book as we went along. But it was really I can't think of the word synergy. Hate to use that word, but it was a synergy of creating the book in a way that made it again quite easy. We've worked together really well in the times. We haven't worked together that much. I mean, here, there, and yonder. We did a few issues about 3 years ago. A couple of issues of X Factor, was there X-Men, and a New Mutants from Marvel. I know the New Mutants. I forget the other two, but it was X books. And she wrote it, and I drew it, and that worked out well. It was no different than working 20, 30 years ago.
Louise, I'd love to know if we can rewind a bit. As I said, we're going to sort of bounce around. When you made the transition from editor to writer, what went into that decision? I guess your first writing work was Power Pack, right? Yeah. So what was the thought process going from editor to writer?
Well, when I did Power Pack, it was because Shooter was after his editors to freelance.
Okay.
I think you've heard that story, right?
Yeah. I think I've heard it from different people
All right, well,
in different ways, but
Shooter was after the editors to freelance because he wanted us to see what it felt like to be on the other side of the desk.
okay.
And so I had this idea for little kids who were superheroes, and presented the idea to him, and he said, maybe we'll get a mini series out of it, write it up. So I wrote it up, and then it turned into a series because he really liked it. So, and then it turned out to be pretty popular. I mean, it won an Eagle Award over in England, and it sold pretty well. So then people started asking me to write other things. I wrote some Spider-Man, and I think filled in some X-Men stuff. Maybe I don't even remember what it was now. Maybe
The Spellbinder was in there somewhere.
yeah, maybe I can't remember. I can't remember the order of any time I did anything. But people started asking me to write things anyway, and I had been editing for a long time. I edited 4 years at Warren, and then maybe I don't know 3 or 4 years at Marvel.
4 years at Marvel.
4 years at Marvel, and it was it had gotten to be too easy. I mean, they hired a batch of new editors, and they cut my workload in half as an editor. And it was just like, yeah, okay, this is just too easy to do. So it turned out that writing was more fun. Not to mention the fact that you can write at home in your pajamas, and I like working from home. So that was kind of what it was. I just got enough offers that it made more sense, and it seemed like it was more fun to write than to edit at that point. Trying something new is always more fun.
The pajamas thing, it seems advantageous as well.
Well, yeah, I suppose so.
I wanted to ask, since we were discussing Power Pack, did you ever plan to have the kids ever grow up or evolve, kind of, in the same vein as, say, Teen Titans?
Not really. I mean, if you take John Byrne's rule, or he posits the theory that 7 years of real time, of our time, is a year of superhero time. So I it would take a while for them to grow up anyway if you go on like that. I know that people have done older Power Pack stories now where the kids are, they joined something or other. I don't even know what it is now. And I'm fine with that. It's been a lot of 7 years since they were created, so I guess they would have grown up by now. But yeah, when I write them now, I like writing them as kids. That's what made it different.
Right.
And it's really what I wanted to do. I think I've always loved kids' books. It's when other kids were, reading comics, I was reading books. I was taken to the library. My mom took me and my sisters to the library every week, and we got out as many books as they would let us take out, and we'd all go home and read the books and trade them back and forth. So, I'm a real kids' book fan. So really, when I did Power Pack, I was doing my kids' book. And I still like writing them as kids. And I don't think anybody's kind of written that mid. I mean, they've written them as little kids, and then they've written them as maybe older teenagers, or even people that are more or less in their 20s. At least Alex probably would be in his 20s. But nobody's done the teenage years yet, or the an older Katie, say. So yeah, when I do it, I'm still aging them over the magic 7-year period. And I think Alex, in my continuity, just had his 13th birthday. So that was, and then I did a little mini series where he and the kids were off in space. But so I'm slowly aging him in my continuity as well. Only it's taking a little longer than 7 years.
Yeah, but that tracks. I mean, for comics, look.
Sure. Oh,
look how, the only ones that really grow up are probably the Teen Titans, and not that much.
Franklin seems to grow up, and then he gets younger, and then he's a real yo-yo.
Yeah, and then there's a crisis, there's a hard reset, so just everything's back to zero, and it really doesn't matter. So here we are.
I know, whatever.
Exactly.
It's comic books.
Exactly. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. I want to make sure I have the sequence correct. But while you, Louise, were working and developing Power Pack. I think this was also the time when you, Walter, were developing and doing your big run on Thor. Um, if that's correct, I was curious about if you ever or always compared notes with each other about your, the trajectory of your stories or how you're developing a certain character in those books.
Well, I talked to Louise a lot about my stuff. Unfortunately, she's stuck reading all my scripts. I figure I'm lucky enough to live with one of the best editors comic books ever had, and I take full advantage of that. And so that's about right. I began doing Thor. 337 came out in, I think, August of 83. And let's see, 80, 81, 82, 83. Weezy quit working at Marvel at the end of 83, probably the end of December, thereabouts. And I don't know if she was starting Power Pack in there somewhere. Probably had started it before she left editing. So it began coming out probably a little bit later. I mean, like a matter of months, but they were kind of running concurrently. Um, we talked about stuff. I don't know if we compared notes on stories so much. I would run a lot of stories by her or plots. And if I was stuck somewhere, I would tell anybody any of the stuff I was working on back then. One of my favorite bits, I had a story where Balder goes to visit Loki and he cuts Loki's head off. Spoiler alert, if you haven't read this stuff, it's 40 years old. I don't care. So,
No.
so Balder cuts Loki's head. Loki provokes Balder. Balder cuts his head off. And after Balder runs screaming out of the room for having done this bad thing, Loki's body is still standing there with a missing head. And after a moment, the body bends over and feels around and picks up the head off the floor and puts it back on again. And because Loki is a sorcerer, and this has got to be something sorcerers learn right in the beginning, is how not to get killed. So that idea really came from Chris Claremont. I was in the office one day. I was talking to Chris. I was that far along in the book, which is around, I don't know, 344 or something like that. I don't remember the number. And about a year in or thereabouts, a little less. And Chris would tell people stories. I would tell him stories. We'd trade back and forth. And I mentioned this. I was talking about it. And I think my original idea was to have Balder finally lose it and throw Loki down and grab his blade and stab down. And when we get a look at it, we see that the blade's gone right, maybe through Loki's ear or right beside his ear, or something like that. And Chris said, "Wow, I thought it was going to cut his head off." And I said, "Ooh, I like that." So not long after that, that was where I went with the plot. But I would talk to Weezy. She would catch holes in my plots that I'd be unaware of. Many years later, there was what was it, the Star Slammers? It was a miniseries I did with the Star Slammers. It came out first from Malibu, and the final issue came out from Dark Horse. And I was getting to the final issue when suddenly I think Weezy found it, but we realized there's some gigantic plot hole, whatever I was doing. I don't remember what it was anymore. I went, "Oh my God." And so there was a lot of rewriting on the last issue to take care of whatever I had going on. So I have Weezy that helped me out. Really been invaluable. And she's been very patient with me when she does. Because usually if she has something that she doesn't like, or she thinks isn't right, or maybe needs a little work, I'm usually pretty grumpy about it, because really all of us want people to go, "Wow, this is the greatest story since sliced bread." Not, "Well, you could probably improve this here, or better fix this one." And then I go back and grumble, and then I go, "Ah, she's right, damn it." And then I have to go back and fix it. And it's really better when I'm done. So it's very helpful. I did in the old days when I was doing Thor, I had so many characters. I used to make a grid. I had a chart. What's the Adobe program that has a grid you can get? The Excel charts, I think. I made my own pre-Excel version of just a simple grid. And down one side, I would list all the characters that were going on in my various stories, because I tried to plot ahead some issues, at least roughly, so I knew where the story was going. And then I would write issues like 337, 338, 339, 340, 341, 340. And in each little box, I would write a couple of notes about what was going to happen to Loki this issue, or Balder had something going on, or the Warriors 3 had something going on, or Thor had something going on, or Lorelei. And I would try and write little notes in. So as I went along, I had some idea of where the story was going to go each issue. Now, sometimes the story would expand and go to an issue beyond, but this kept me organized regarding the stories, and with all the subplots I had going on, it was a big help. So I had that going for me as well. But Wheezy was really my advisor on all those stories.
We were sort of vaguely aware, at least, of what the other person was doing in the different stories, and there was the occasional instance where we do a crossover with stuff.
Yeah. Well, the Mutant
Like
Massacre was the big one.
Or Fall of the Mutants or Inferno. I think you when you were doing.
I think by the time we did Fall of the Mutants, I think I was off Thor and Duke. Well, I think I wasn't even writing Thor anymore. I don't think. In the Mutant Massacre, which is the first big one, I was writing Thor, Sal was drawing it, I was drawing X Factor, you were writing it, you were writing New Mutants, Brett Blevins was drawing New Mutants, Chris was doing X-Men. I've forgotten who the artist was in X-Men right at that time. And was he writing any other books that were in that crossover? Was that it? Just the X-Men? Seems like I should have one more in there, but I don't remember. But we made some charts for that as well. But and by the time we did Fall of the Mutants a year later, I might have been off Thor by that. I don't remember if Thor was involved in that or not. I sort of don't think so, but I was drawing X Factor by then, so that was kind of taking up most of my time.
So I want to ask, your career paths basically cross. Louise started Marvel, you go to DC, and Walt vice versa. What were your experiences like? I mean, you're both working at distinguished competition for each other, and you switch. You basically you switch teams. What was that like? Where it's an interesting experience for the two of you. Certainly as fans hearing about it, you must have some some comparisons, some interesting stories for that period of time.
I don't know that. I mean, I was only probably at Marvel a year or two after Wheezy left. I wasn't there. Let me think, how did that work? And that actually was over at DC. I was under contract at Marvel for about 14 years. And I left not long after Wheezy, probably within a year. I didn't go with the comic books, but probably in about a year or maybe a shade more, but not much. And then I went to DC. I was at DC for about 14 years. And Wheezy was there doing the Superman for what, 9, I think, Sugar?
About 9 years.
So we had a lot of overlap at each company, not a lot of overlap where one of us was at one company, one was at the other. But
Okay.
it didn't really make any difference. I mean, it was not, as a freelancer, I didn't have a lot of Marvel trade secrets I was going to spill to Wheezy and vice versa.
Hey,
I knew some of the stuff that was going on in Superman. I wasn't, there weren't any podcasts back. Well, maybe it went 88, 89. Were there podcasts by then? I wasn't on any, I know that. So, and I gave, you do some interviews, print interviews, but, so I knew some of the stuff going on in Superman, Wheezy. We would exchange stories about what we were doing, what we were working on. But I don't know if there's anything really secret. I did hear some about like the Superman retreats where like once or twice a year, the Superman teams will all get together. And then Mike Carlin, I have to say kudos to Mike Carlin. Mike was the editor on those books for some years when Wheezy went to work for DC and worked for Superman. And he had 4 or 5 creative teams, depending on how many books there were at the time. And, as you can imagine, it was like herding cats. So he was really able to do that wonderfully and keep all these people going. I think of Ben-Hur in the chariot race and all these chariots kind of going in the same, down the arena at the same speed, more or less lined up and not running over each other.
But going as fast as we could, because if you stumbled, then the person behind you was screwed up because everybody was doing a monthly book. So
yeah, maybe a better analogy was if all the chariots are racing in line, one in front of the other, one behind the other. And so if someone in the front, if one in front screwed up, the second one would hit it. So you really had to get your work done and then they would get the Xeroxes of all that stuff, the scripts, the plots, the pencils would all be sent out to everybody so you could see what was going on, keep up, and then figure out where your story was going to go. It was really amazing. It was just one of the one of the most amazing feats of organization I think I've seen in comics in my career. Watching, and that ran for I don't know how long Mike was. Louise was there for 9 years. Mike was not there for all of it, but he was there for a lot of it.
He
And
was my editor for about 4 years before he moved over to the editor-in-chief position, and we got, several other different people who edited the Superman books.
but he was great. So I would hear some stories about that. I hear a couple of stories I'm not going to say here on the relate here on the video cast. But it was really what happens in regular freelancing as well. Every so often you bump elbows with somebody. You're either trying to get the same book or you're whatever. I haven't had much of that happen to me really, but I've seen it happen, and it can be a little tense occasionally, but mostly you're just trying to get the job done. And honestly, getting one comic book out in a month with what editor, writer, penciler, inker, letterer, color with 6 people, you don't have a lot of time for bitching at each other because you have to get the work done. And they did get all that stuff out. And occasionally there were 5 books in a month because of skip week or something. I never understood the geometry of that, but there was something like that going on. So it was really impressive just to watch that. And I would think I would be grousing about getting this one book out every month and then looking around and going, yeah, I guess I don't have it so bad.
Part of the difference between working at Marvel and working at DC on the Superman books was that in general, you would worry about the continuity just in your own book. You'd have the beginning and you do the middle and you do the end. But in the Superman books, because it was during the Triangle era.
Yep.
One of us would start the story and somebody would do the middle and somebody would do the end, or however long the different arcs ran, so that it took me a little while to get used to that. It was sort of because I was so used to doing it all. It probably took me about 6 months before I began to sort of figure out how to arrange my stories to actually take advantage of that.
There's also a different storytelling structure in a way, in that you still want the comic you're writing to be a kind of feel like a complete unit
Have a
of
beginning
some
and
sort.
and its own continuity. I mean, its own integrity. But then,
And yet, at the same time, sometimes that integrity, you're telling a story that's in the middle of some larger story.
Mm-hmm.
So you're trying to figure out how to tell a middle that both feels like a beginning and an end, and yet is also the middle part of this story that goes on after you're done. And the same is true for writing the beginning or writing the ending. You can write the beginning, but you want to end up. And my example, a good example of that is on in comics would be the first Star Wars film, because in that one you start off with Luke on the evaporator moisture farm or whatever the heck it is, and by the end you have a complete story, but you also have all this universe out beyond you that you haven't completed the story, and the story about Darth Vader, the story about the Emperor or the Republic or the Empire. And so you have all that stuff to go, but you still feel like you've gotten a complete meal at one time. And that's the trick in these comics, is you have to do it every month. Each month you've got to create a complete meal and still be part of this ongoing chain.
Yeah. How did that work for you? Because, when I started reading comics, it was right when Death of Superman was going on. And I was, I introduced to Superman comics, and well, clearly I'm a fan, but Triangle era was my absolute favorite. But as a writer, I mean, what are you given any guidance as to what to do? I mean, you mentioned you have your story you want to tell, but there are these other subsequent issues. Next week is Man of Steel. After that, Superman, Adventures of Superman. And so are you told, okay, you have to get from point A to point B, make your story fit in there some way? Or
well, the good part about that was that we weren't told how to do it.
okay,
arranged it ourselves at these meetings. I mean, Carlin was certainly part of that, and he was definitely the ringmaster. But everyone was allowed to bring ideas, including the colorists and the letterers, people who wouldn't usually get a say in, or be able to make those kind of like creative suggestions. Everybody was there. Everybody got to suggest, and we would have this big chart up on the wall, and Carlin or one of his assistants would write in. We would talk about it, and they would write in, okay, this is going to be a story about, oh, I don't know, we did a story about a guy who beat up his wife and how Superman was able to deal with it. I think it was a 3-parter, if I'm remembering right. And it was like, so you get the beginning, the middle, and the end, and he would actually write roughly on the wall, wife beater story, I don't know, blah blah blah. And we would talk about together what we were going to do, but we weren't. And then we would of course work out the major continuity, and then the like minor continuity parts too, in a very rough sort of way. But once we had it up on the board and it was decided, well, then we could arrange it any way we wanted to, as long as we made a proper story out of it and made an ending that the next guy could pick up. So it was just a different way of thinking about stories.
Mm-hmm.
And what was another thing that was interesting was that it was done, instead of being full script, the way that the Marvel books, the DC books were generally done. I mean, we worked plot first on those stories. So yeah, I would do a plot, and then I would get pencils back, and then I would script from that. So it was more like almost like a doing Marvel style for DC. I think a lot of us had a more Marvel approach. I know Carlin did too. In fact, people would say, "Oh, it's like Marvel's." It was like DC's Marvel book.
I feel like the balance that you talked about, both of you talked about, between having discrete stories in an issue but tying into something larger, is kind of a lost art nowadays, not only in comics, but I feel like in sequential storytelling on TV, where it almost feels like they really have sacrificed that discrete story in terms of like middle chapters, that it really is just trying to get to the next chapter of a book, rather than something that you can be satisfied with just in its own unit. Do you feel like that we've gotten away from that kind of balance that we used to have?
I think they're not doing that as much. I don't think they care as much about having a discrete 20 or 22 pages. Let's use 20 pages now in one of the floppies. And I think it's partly because of graphic novels and collections.
Yeah.
So it's again another way of telling the stories and presenting them. And that's kind of again dependent on I guess just the process, which is a whole different process. It's really a process for creating graphic novels in a sequential manner.
Right.
I mean, I actually like it best with, I think you get a nice rhythm even if you do have, a discrete, if you have a series of discrete stories that are heading toward a larger ending. But, that's just my own personal preference.
Right.
That's what I like too. That's the way I work and the stuff. Even the stuff I do now, I work like that. But I will tell you a secret, and the secret is I haven't read any modern comics in I don't know how long. And I only had one comic I read regularly. That was Usagi Yojimbo by Stan Sakai.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And Louise and I moved about 10 months ago. And I've only just established a relationship with my local comic shop. So I haven't even looked at any comics since last May, probably since a little before that when we were moving. We were pretty busy trying to pack up and get out of there. And the upshot is that I really have no idea what's going on in modern comics. Occasionally I've drawn one. I did one with Tom King a few years ago about Batman's death. And I've done this stuff with Louise a couple of years ago, X Factor and or X-Men, whatever it was, and New Mutants. But I still remember some years ago, and this is like 10 years ago now. I had to I was doing a kind of write and draw a couple of issues of comics, I think maybe for DC, and I needed some background. It didn't turn out to be very important, but I needed some. So I got a handful of current comics and read them. And I think one of them was a team book. Do not remember. I'm not lying. I don't know which team book it was. It sort of doesn't matter. And what I found was in reading the book, well, first of all, from the time I'd read these characters, all their costumes were changed. I don't mind that. I've seen that happen. I've done it myself. That said, very little was established. There were issues where characters' names were never used. I had no idea who they were. I didn't know what their backstory was. I didn't know what the hell they were doing in this melee or whatever was going on. And by the time I was done, I was no wiser than I had been when I started reading the comic, except I had about 10 minutes I was never going to get back. So that, and I, somewhere in there, I said, well, I'm not, look, I'm old. I'm not the demographic for these comics anymore. I might be for the old ones. I can still go back and read old comics and enjoy them. But a lot of the stuff I read, and this is already 10 years back, I found a lot of them, I think like Weezy said, they're designed to be 6-issue arcs or whatever they put into the collections. I don't think, this is not true of every writer by any means, but the ones I've looked at, there's not a lot of care in making a unit out of a single comic. You're thinking about the whole thing and having it all put together. And sometimes that does lead to like an expanded storyline. Something that in the old days might have got told in 1 issue or 2 issues is now being told in 6. So they feel occasionally a little padded. And I'm just not, I'm not the audience for that stuff. I'm not, I probably haven't been for a long time. I still love going out and finding Jesse Marsh Tarzans from 1955, and I find those a lot of fun. But and other ones too. I don't back collect. I'm done. Actually, when we moved, I sold most of my collection. I've had comics for a million years, and I've kept some of the old ones I had as a child, nostalgic reasons. But really, and I've got like the hardcover reprints of Carl Barks' work and John Stanley's Little Lulu work. I can read those, enjoy them immensely to this day. But mostly modern comics are not so interesting to me. Oddball things. Dean Haspiel does a lot of weird stuff that I find really interesting. But that's not superhero comics. That's a whole different thing. So, and there are a few others like that I see from him. Stan Sakai's work, I said, Usagi Yojimbo, I read for the same reason I read comics as a kid. They're good stories. They're well told. And they're about everything. There are stories that are full of pathos. There are stories that are comedies. He just covers the waterfront. There are stories that are 1-issue stories. There are as much as 4-issue stories. I don't know if Stan has gone beyond 4 issues. I don't remember how long Grasscutter was, but I really enjoyed those. So I'm hoping now that I've reestablished connection with the comic shop to start getting them again, because I must have missed whatever came out from last May on. I haven't seen and I haven't read them. I would get those comics, bring them home, and read them immediately. So and I read them again because they were good stories, well told. And that's what I'm looking for in a comic.
Makes sense. we're all trying to find what we I think originally discovered when we discovered comics. We want that kind of sense of adventure or humor or whatever it was.
Also, I do think that as the years have gone by, the demographics have changed. So I mean, still a lot of older readers in comics, but I think the style of storytelling changes the same way the style of clothes changes. And it may very well be that I'm not wearing a lot of modern clothes myself. Whatever those clothes are, I'm not wearing them. And it may be that gets in the way of my enjoying, say, a modern comic. where it's told in a different style. There are some amazing draftsmen out there. Lena Yu for one. There are other guys I don't know. I just saw a recent one, art on the web, by an Asian artist. I don't remember his name. Last name was like YG or something like that. And it was a kind of like a Power Rangers type comic. I'm not sure it was the Power Rangers, but it was just beautifully drawn. And I found he had an Instagram. So I went on Instagram. I found him there. It was like the YG was an abbreviation for whatever his last name was. And he had an email address there. So I just wrote him a note and said how much I enjoyed this drawing. I don't know what his comic book work is like as far as storytelling, but the drawing itself was just gorgeous. So there are guys out there who are spectacular draftsmen. I think the level of draftsmanship in a lot of ways has only improved over the years. Whether that equates to a level of storytelling, I don't know. I just haven't read enough stuff. But I am really wowed by the draftsmanship I see in comics these days.
Stories are more compacted than they were more compacted in the olden days than they are now.
Yeah.
So that I know that I will occasionally hear from people who think the old stories are really crowded. Like there's so much, it moves so fast and there's so much going on, and it doesn't take time to breathe and have its little moments. And I think in a way they're right, because that's what modern people are used to. It would be nice to kind of spend, a whole page on, soulful glances or something. But in the olden days, we didn't have time for that. We had to tell a beginning, a middle, and an end, and get some excitement and character and stuff into 22 pages. So, but it's interesting. It's a whole different way of doing it. I read a batch of newer X-Men comics, like over the past stuff from the past 40 years, actually, when I did the Jean Grey miniseries a little while ago. And I it was pretty exciting stuff, but it was less dense than the work that we did back in the day. So which doesn't mean it was worse in any way. It was just, a different pacing.
What's funny because it's almost the reverse in the Star Wars films. I've had friends who have kids, and the friends love Star Wars, and they show the kids, or in some cases the grandkids, the Star Wars films. And the first film they're watching, going, "Oh my dad, this is so boring. It's taking so long to get anywhere.
Yeah.
Holy cow!" And then you watch the more recent ones. Stuff's exploding every 4 seconds. And so they've really picked up the pace. I'm not sure they've crammed much more story into it, but they picked up the pace of the explosions compared to what they used to do. So maybe that's the other way around. But the pacing has changed, and it's changed both in comics and in movies. Maybe not in the same way, but time does bring changes to the way people tell their stories. And so it may be that, I used to teach at the School of Visual Arts. I taught there over a period of 20 years, for about 11 or 12 years in that time. I kept quitting. They kept pulling me back in. But eventually I retired some years ago now, because I really felt that I couldn't teach younger students, how to do comics that would appeal to a modern audience. They really needed to be taught by people who are a lot younger than me now, who understood how comics were told. That, the way I did. I lived, eat, and breathed comics back when I was in college. Before that, then in college. So I never have to look at a Jack Kirby story again. All the stuff I had to learn from Jack Kirby, it's all inside here right now. I still go back and look at other artists. There are artists I go back and study all the time. But at this point, they're all artists that are probably 40, 50, 30 years old. And that's the stuff I still love. So I'll go back and look at that, and I will use that as a springboard for my own work in many ways. But I thought these kids, they ought to have artists who were, lived on Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane and other artists, and maybe a little more recent than that, and had lived, eaten, and breathed those guys, so they could bring that kind of passion and work and understanding to the teaching that they were doing to children and young students who are going to have to learn how to, get work in the business now if the industry continues to survive.
Louise, I'm going to ask you a question I asked you last time, so prepare. Um, Death of Superman. Go. No. I want to ask you about that. Basically, your experience at that time working on that storyline, and last time when I had the pleasure of talking to you, I mentioned your interview on one of the extras for the Death of Superman DVD at the time, and I still remember it clear as day when I watched it, because your passion while talking about Superman and the Death of Superman, everything that went into it, and watching you get emotional about it, it still sticks with me. And we talked to another friend of mine who is another huge Superman fan who has a whole podcast about Superman, and I had the pleasure of relaying, kind of memory to him, and it really is, for someone to speak to the creator of one of the most amazing storylines and to see how emotional they are about it is amazing. So, enough of the preamble. What was that like for you during that time? It was, we all hear about the summits that go into, discussing Superman and planning. And we touched on it earlier, but that must have been absolutely bananas for you.
Well, at the time, we all were trying to tell a really good story. That was kind of what it came down to. And I think that it was like everybody was doing their best, or trying to do their best anyway. So that, and I think it turned out really well. And I mean, there were some disagreements along, because it's creative process and creative people and herding cats, blah, blah. So, but I think that partly because Mike Carlin was such a good editor, I think it worked. I mean, we all had our agendas. Like, I wanted to tell the world without Superman. That was my focus. I think Dan wanted to think Dan wanted to do the big fight. He wanted to kill Superman and then, I guess, bring him back. I don't know. I guess, but he really wanted to do that knockdown drag out. And other people had other focuses things that sort of grabbed them. And I think because of that, I think that added to the passion of it that we all had, and the reason we wanted to make it the best we could. And, the miracle was that it actually turned out pretty well, because a lot, it's wanting to do something great, or at least, do something great doesn't always mean that you're going to succeed. It's like, there were so many hands involved in this project. And the fact that we were actually able to more or less pull it off, I think really was, it was a very cool thing to be a part of. Part of the problem was that we all knew you can't kill Superman forever. I mean, we knew that it was not our character. We didn't own him, and he was licensed around the world, but we actually had to sign NDAs that said we weren't allowed to discuss it. We weren't allowed to say what we knew was going to happen next. We weren't allowed to tell people, no, don't buy 2 million of these. He's going to get better. And I think a lot of us felt kind of bad about that when we didn't know that it was going to be such a phenomenon. I mean, it was partly that it was Superman, but it was partly that it was luck. It was a slow news week, and it got on national news. And then it got on national news around, or world news actually, because we had a friend in Jeff Darrow in France was
He was in a cab.
what was that, darling?
He
Yes, he
was in
was
a
in a
cab.
cab, and the cab driver found out he was an American who did comics and started fussing at him because how could Americans allow Superman to die? So that was, you know, I mean, it was interesting, and it was it was it was really cool that so many people wanted to wanted to read about Superman, because part of our, I guess, maybe annoyance with the universe was that it was a time when people admired dark characters. Batman was dark and he was kind of, he was a good guy, and Superman was always a good guy. And who wants to read about a goody two shoes? And we all really loved Superman and wanted our hero to be admired too. So that was part of the impetus for killing him, was that, yeah, see what the world is like without Superman. See how you like that, Buster. And that part worked, is that he a lot of people started reading Superman. So that was cool. I felt kind of bad that so many little kids were picking up Superman, and we had 6-year-olds, and these two guys, they're beating each other to death, with their fists. And we're saying, here, kids, Superman comics are good comics. And it's like, oh God. So I felt kind of guilty about how violent it was. But honestly, you sort of had to do it that way, or else it wouldn't have really worked. So yeah. And I keep asking people that I run into at conventions who say they started reading with the death of Superman. And I say, so tell me, were you traumatized? And they said, oh no, we loved it. The 6-year-olds, it's like, oh God. Anyway, but that was, Superman got up some fans those during those days. So we were very lucky.
Yeah, definitely resonated with me. And I'm sure Mike.
Tell me you were 6.
I was not 6. No, no, I was a little bit older. I used to go to Mike's house and read his comic because he was collecting before and I would flip through it. I'm like, so they killed Superman? And then it was Mike and our other bandit friend, Oren, who were just telling me, like, why don't you just start collecting comics instead of reading ours? So that's what did it. But yeah, stop creasing our paper. But yeah, I was a Superman fan before that. But reading that story arc, the death of, and World Without Superman, the return of, and all that. I mean, I have a poster over there, Death of Superman, with all the characters, and I have just, as you can see, all kinds of stuff. But it's one that I always, I think it's one of the stories that when people start talking about comics, there are certain arcs that they refer to, and they're talking about, well, this run on X-Men and this and that and Crisis and the Death of Superman always comes up. So it always sticks with me. So I think at this point we've had the pleasure of talking to almost everyone involved in that creative process for that storyline. So it's just great. So I want to, not that we're signing off at the moment, but I just want to say thank you for everything that you've done.
It was our pleasure, believe me.
Well, as we we'll come to a close. I like this question, and I hope you do too. I don't know if you've been asked it before, but I'd love to know each of your favorite works of the others.
Oh golly.
Well, I like Power Pack just in general, but there's a New Mutant story. Forgot the issue number. Brett Blevins drew it, and it's when Wheezy. There was a character in the New Mutants named Doug Ramsey. And Doug Ramsey's superpower was to be able to decipher any language or cryptogram or whatever, something like that. And to be honest, that's not a very visual power. And you have to write a story in which it's like, oh my God, if we don't decipher this cryptogram, this guy will die. Doug, what does it say? So you have this kind of forced thing in a way that you have to kind of get in there in order to give this guy a moment. And for a variety of reasons, it's a longer story than this, but I'm not going to go into that. For a variety of reasons, Wheezy decided that Doug Ramsey was going to die. It was
We
not. What's that?
Doug Ramsey is boring. He doesn't do anything. You should kill him.
These are letters from fans.
From fans.
But just so we know.
Very blunt, aren't
they?
they?
So she did kill him. And he had a good buddy named Warlock. It was obviously a Bill Sienkiewicz created character that were, at least Bill Reed Edelman created him in a way that was just nobody could duplicate. But Brett did a pretty good job. And after Doug dies, Warlock, who comes from a race of aliens, I don't think they die at all. They just kind of continue and they split and they become other being, whatever they do. So he did not understand the concept that Doug was dead and that was the end of him. So he digs him up out of the grave.
No, he actually just pulls him out of his coffin.
He pulls him out of the coffin. I can't remember. I did read a long time ago.
Let's be accurate here.
Well, let's be accurate. So I should let Wheezy say what happened. But the idea that Doug is trying to understand, it's what it really is a short meditation about the meaning of death. And I thought that was really powerful. And that's one of the favorite things that Wheezy has written that I like, or one of my favorite things of the work that she's written.
And one of our favorite letters came from that.
It did.
Someone wrote me and said, I used to hate Doug Ramsey and think he was boring and think he should be dead. But now that you killed him, I realize that he was always my favorite character. That's
the best.
You did it.
That's one of the 2 or 3 best letters we ever got.
Mine changed.
So that was, but I mean, as far as Walters, my favorite of Walters, oh gosh. Okay, let's see, I loved the Alien adaptation. I loved the Fantastic Four time travel story where the FF are Reed is fighting Dr. Doom and they're zipping back and forth from page to page, from time to time, back and forth in time. I thought that was brilliant. The Star Slammers was great. Thor, of course, was always all good. It was great. So yeah, Walter, just everything he does is wonderful. But
thank you, honey.
Good answer.
Actually, the new stuff. What is it? The new Thor.
Ragnarok,
your very own Thor is really pretty good too.
What's also fun, I get whatever I want in it. And one of the things that I did do, I'm just going to mention because I just liked it. It's nothing you couldn't do in any ordinary comic, but I didn't have a chance to do it in Thor before for Marvel, which is I sent Thor down into hell to confront hell herself. And as he's starting down, there are these giant 4-legged beasts that are talking with him and they're sort of amusing, kind of like guardians to the entrance of hell. And what's fun about them, for me, I was a geology major in college. I wanted to study paleontology. I veered off in a different direction, as you can see, but I
wasn't exciting enough.
Stuff. What's that?
Wasn't exciting enough?
No, it wasn't exciting enough. Dinosaurs weren't big enough for me. I needed bigger things. So, but what those creatures are, might be the very first dinosaurs ever described and given a name. It's called Megalosaurus. It's out of England. I don't know if they have much more fossil remains evidence now. There was very little evidence back in the old days, but it was it was a predator, and it would have been built along the lines of one of the theropods or one of the tyrannosaurs, something like that, running and the tail at the back and stuff. And, but the early adaptations, I love the early recreations of dinosaurs because they're so loony. And they're so different from what we come to think of now. It was the best they could do. It's not like I'm making fun of that stuff. I think it's fabulous. But the Megalosaur was this giant 4-legged creature with this long snout and a lot of teeth. And those creatures who are greeting my Thor at the mouth of hell are Megalosaurs. or megalosauruses. And I thought it'd be a great place to use them because they look so cool in the old lithographs that they used to do to recreate these guys. I may use some more ancient recreations of dinosaurs in other stories eventually, but that's what those guys are. And it was such a treat to be able to draw them into a comic and have them kind of make sense in a whole different context.
And basically it comes down to when we tell stories, if we're going to do something fun with it, when we're really amusing ourselves. I mean, that megalosaur thing, that's just Walter amusing himself.
Absolutely.
So, in
a way that seemed to make sense for the story.
Yes, if you can't have fun with it for yourself, if you're not interested, nobody else is going to be. So
that's right.
Absolutely.
Good philosophy.
Yeah.
And also a good segue into what each of you is doing now or in the near future that fans can look forward to. More Ragnarok, we hope?
There will be more Ragnarok. We're in the middle of a bunch of paperwork because Scott Doombeer, my editor, left IDW, which was my publisher. And I'm following Scott over to Act 4, which is his new company, which he's getting underway. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of balls are up in the air right now. So my hope, don't hold me to this, but my hope is that the next Ragnarok arc will start coming out the beginning of next year. But we are still juggling paper at the moment. So I'm hoping the sooner that gets done, the sooner I can kind of really get started. But and then in the meantime, mostly I do variant covers for the odd comic here and there. I did a Fantastic Four cover recently with Kang, a huge head of Kang in the background. And he had his hands out like he's trying to grab them, like an old-fashioned cover. And it was really based on an Avengers cover. There's an Avengers cover from issue 24, 25 with a big head of Kang and his hands reaching out over the Avengers. And it's beautifully colored, one of my favorite covers. So I basically did my tip of the hat to that cover without doing exactly the same one. I've done several other covers, a couple of which I can't say anything about yet because they haven't been released and it hasn't been announced. So it's a weird world for me now because before I could have done covers and just put them up on the web and nobody cared. Now everybody cares. They all freak out. So I've got some questions about that, but we won't go into that now. So, but I am doing some covers like that. I've got a couple more lining up right now, actually.
What about your giant drawing, honey?
What's that?
The giant.
Yeah.
Oh, I did do a giant
battle
drawing.
of
That's right, the Battle of Muspelheim.
Yes.
That took me about 3 years to do. I was not working on it steadily. It's 5 feet wide and about 3.5 feet high. If you're on Facebook or Instagram or Threads, probably even Twitter, or X. I'm kind of getting off X at the moment. I haven't decided fully yet, but I'm not a big fan of a lot of the X stuff. So that may be going away. But the other ones, I have put up a pretty good, reasonable resolution. I got a high-res scan of the whole drawing, all 5 feet of it. I had to go down to New Jersey to do that, to find a place that would do it. But that was a commission, and it's basically Surtur fighting all of the Asgardians, or at least a lot of the Asgardians in the Marvel Universe. There are a bunch of fire demons I added Fenris Wolf fighting Loki because what the heck, why not? It's not really an accurate Ragnarok, but it was still a lot of fun to do. But it did take me a long time. And when we moved, I probably had at least 6 months where I didn't touch it. So it wasn't like I worked on it steadily for 3 years and finally got it done. I worked on it in spurts. And then in the end, the last 3 months, the end of last year from November on, I just worked on that and nothing. I was sick of looking at it. So I just worked on that and got it out of there by the second week of January. So, and that was a good chunk of my time previously. But if you're on Facebook or Instagram, on Facebook, I have galleries of art. One of the galleries is the Battle of Muspelheim. And you can see the drawing. You can see stages of the drawing. You can see me standing in front of this giant sheet of roof insulation with the drawing taped to it. That's how I was able to get it straight. But sitting on our dining room chairs, which were underneath the drawing for 2 or 3 years. But you get a good look at it. And on Instagram and on Threads, you can at least find the full drawing from probably 2 months ago or so by now. And that was fun.
Isn't that insulation the most versatile stuff in the world? I use it for cutting wood and everything. Yes. It's amazing.
I took the job partly because I thought I would learn a lot from it. I did. But one of the things I had to figure out was I had a single sheet of paper. A friend of mine who's an artist who paints big pictures, including pictures on paper, had a roll, a 3.5 or 4 foot wide roll of Strathmore 400, which is it's really good drawing paper. The 500 is the best. 400 is great. So I went to New York. I got 2 sheets of this stuff in case I screwed up one of them. And I had to figure out some way to keep it flat so I could draw on it. And I went into Home Depot or Lowe's, I don't remember, and walked around. I thought about masonite. Masonite would be a great surface to work on and tape stuff. It would also weigh 5,000 pounds. And so in looking, I found roof insulation,
Mhm.
Foamular, I think it was called. Whoever puts that with a Pink Panther is their
Yeah.
logo.
Yeah.
And it came in 4x8 sheets and it weighs nothing.
Yeah. It's awesome.
So I got them to cut it down to 4x6, which is a little bigger than my drawing. I had to get the whole thing. And then we had to rent a truck, a box truck, to get it home. It was too big to fit in our car. So we had a box truck we had to rent. That was Home Depot because it was a time. And the box truck it was only $19.95 if you rented it for an hour. After that, it was more money. So we got home. At the time, our old house, we lived at the top of a long, steep driveway, and it was raining lightly. It had been. There were leaves on the ground, and the truck couldn't get up the driveway.
Oh, Jesus.
So I hopped out, ran around behind, pulled this thing out, didn't weigh anything. She took one end, I took the other. We walked it up the driveway. I had the garage door open, unfortunately. Got the garage door open, put the thing in there, closed it, ran back down the hill, hopped in the truck, roared back to Home Depot, and got there with 2 minutes to spare before the hour was up. So it was a learning experience and quite an experience in drawing. And some of that will show up in the gallery if you want to go take a look at it. I don't have any pictures of the truck,
That's it.
but there are.
Yeah, I've tried that stuff to the roof of my car and almost blew it away. It was great.
Yeah, I didn't dare. I was exactly what I was
Thought
afraid
of
of.
that, but it was like,
Would have just flipped
Yeah.
up and gone,
Nice
or
gust of
broken in
wind,
half.
and I could feel just look.
Yep. Yep. I didn't do that. I didn't think I could do that. But it
I
was
hope
fun.
Bill Gates enjoys his commission.
Yep, I probably. So I hope he has a good. I hope he enjoys it a lot. So, and then Wheezy has to tell you what she's working on.
I'm working on a thing that I'm not in any position yet to talk about with Gender Sema that I hope we'll be doing it. We'll see.
And we are back. Look, I don't know what I could say that hasn't already been said about these two. It was an honor and a privilege, like I said initially, to be talking to them together. It was great. It would have been great to talk to either one of them on their own. But it was so much fun. They have both just amazing careers in comics, so much to tell. I hope we get the opportunity to talk to them on their own. And just, to hear how their lives affected one another in the world of comics. And, my favorite part of it, obviously, is discussing Death of Superman with Louise. Everyone's heard me talk about it. I won't go into further detail, but it was just a privilege.
Yeah, these are two titans of the industry, and they happen to be married to each other. They're sort of comic book king and queen, and loved talking to both of them. Yes, I'd love the opportunity to talk to Walter again on his own, and especially Louise also, because they've done just so much. It's hard to contain it within one episode, especially with two of them. But thank you so much, Walter and Louise, for getting on the horn with us. And also, how cool is that huge commission that Walter put together? The Battle of Jotunheim, was it?
Jotunheim.
I'm probably getting the realm wrong. But anyway, go look that up on Instagram. It's phenomenal. All the process shots and everything and how that came out. It's just a phenomenal piece. But that will do it for today's episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you again to Walter and Louise for coming on the show. Thanks, Joe, for all your producing. know-how and
Thank you.
and co-hosting. Thank you, thank you. And thank you all out there for listening, for viewing, rating, reviewing, subscribing, doing all the good work that helps Dollar Bin Bandits get into more ear holes. That is the goal. So thank you, and we will see you next issue.